Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Buenas tardes a todas y todos. Gracias por estar aquí esta tarde. El día de hoy tenemos el foro ¿Qué es el racismo estratégico? Welcome everyone to our forum. Today, our forum is titled What is Strategic Racism? Before we start, and since we are committed to language justice, I am going to ask Olga, our interpreter for tonight from the Community Language Co-op, to give us some instructions on how to use the interpretation service. Voy a dejar que Olga se comunique con nosotros y nos explique cómo se va a usar el servicio de interpretación. Adelante, Olga.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, my name is Olga Sosa, and I am here with the Community Language Co-op, and we're here to help create a space for language justice. What that means is that we want to create a space where everyone can participate and engage in their own language, or in the language of their heart, or the one that they feel most comfortable in. We will use simultaneous interpretation to create this space. When I finish saying this in Spanish, we will turn on interpretation, and you will see a global icon that says interpretation. Everyone needs to choose a language at that time. If you're not fully bilingual, we ask that you select your preferred language. If you are bilingual, feel free to listen to everyone in their language. When you select your language, you can check mute original audio so you don't have to hear both languages at the same time. Hola a todos y todas, estamos aquí, mi nombre es Olga Sosa y estoy aquí con la comunidad del lenguaje y estamos aquí para ayudar a crear un espacio donde todos practicamos la justicia del lenguaje. Lo que eso significa es que queremos crear un espacio donde todos puedan participar e involucrarse en el idioma de su corazón o en el idioma en el que se sientan más cómodos. Usaremos la interpretación simultánea para crear este espacio. Cuando termine de decir esto, activaremos la interpretación y verá un icono de globo que dice interpretación en la parte derecha de su computadora. O si está usando su teléfono, lo puede ver en los puntitos que salen. Si no es completamente bilingüe, le pedimos que seleccione su idioma preferido. Si es bilingüe, puede escuchar a todos en su idioma. Cuando seleccione su idioma, puede hacer clic en silenciar el audio original para que no escuche ambos idiomas al mismo tiempo. Okay, we're ready. We're set to go. Gracias a todos.
Thank you, Olga. We're going to just make a little test to make sure that you are all listening in the language of your preference. Okay, so remember that you should select at least one of the options. Otherwise, you won't be able to listen to the conversation that we're going to have today. So welcome, everyone. And I'm going to take a moment to introduce myself, talk a little bit about the Denver Justice and Peace Committee, and then I will let Jim Freeman, our guest for tonight, explain how we're going to have this conversation. I am Rebecca Zuniga, and my preferred gender pronouns are ella, ellas, she, her, them. As a settler in other nations' land, I want to recognize that today I join you from the ancestral land of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute. I invite you to tell us through the chat where you're joining us from. I am the director of the Denver Justice and Peace Committee. We are a nonprofit organization based here in Denver, dedicated to promoting international solidarity with the peoples of Latin America. We do our work through advocacy and education, and this forum is one of the ways we carry out our mission. Today's forum, What is Strategic Racism, will be facilitated by Jim Freeman, Director of the Social Movement Support Lab at the University of Denver. We use this space as an opportunity to foster interactive and stimulating discussion we want you to feel comfortable to ask any question and use the chat to pose your questions, or you can also open your camera and your mic and do the question directly when the time comes. Thank you for being here today, and we hope to uncover the issues related to systemic racism and what we can do to challenge ourselves. Jim Freeman directs the Social Movement Support Lab, which provides multidisciplinary assistance to communities that are fighting systemic racism and creating positive social change. He has supported dozens of grassroots-led efforts to end mass criminalization and incarceration, achieve education equity, dismantle the school to prison pipeline, align community budgets with community priorities, protect immigrants' rights, and create a more inclusive and participatory democracy. Freeman is the author of Rich Thanks to Racism: How the Ultra-Wealthy Profit from Racial Injustice, published by Cornell in 2021. He has served under President Obama as a commissioner on the White House Initiative on Education Excellence for African Americans. Freeman is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame and Harvard Law School, and was an editor on the Harvard Law Review. He is former Skadden Fellow, clerked for Judge James R. Browning, and on the Ninth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, and has been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center, the University of Denver Sturm College of Law, and the Korbel School of International Studies. Welcome, Jim. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I appreciate it. It's good to be here with you all. So what I would love to do, if it's okay with everybody, is talk for a little bit about the book, sort of the central idea behind the book, and then I'd love to have a conversation about it, and I'd love to get folks, reflections on it, and really have a discussion about what collectively we could do about it. But before that, it probably makes sense to tell you what it's about. So let me start there, and maybe more specifically start with how the book came about, because as Rebecca was saying in my bio, I work with communities that are looking to address systemic racism and create transformative social change, and I've been doing that for about 20 years, and I've worked with groups from all over the U.S., in the communities that are most directly impacted by systemic racism. So Black and Brown communities in Mississippi and Philadelphia, Oakland, Chicago, Phoenix, Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago, New York, here in Denver, and lots of other places. And, for a long time in my career, what I thought we were fighting against was ignorance. In other words, I believed that all we had to do was educate people on the realities of systemic racism, around what people were facing and how to address them. And that would be enough to fix these glaring problems. And I sincerely believed for much of my career that that would be enough for, as Dr. King said, for the moral arc of the universe to bend towards justice. And honestly, if I'd only been working in one geographic area, I would probably still believe that. But because I worked across many cities and states, I began to see patterns in the opposition that we faced. And regardless of which state or region of the country I was working in, I noticed that we kept running into the same unjust policies that were usually being supported by the same advocacy organizations and think tanks and media outlets. So all across the country, when the communities I was working with would attempt to address the most significant barriers they face in their day-to-day lives, they would often run squarely into the same people pushing the same set of really devastating policy ideas. So, for me, over and over, I would encounter policymakers in various states who would somehow all seem to have the exact same ideas for new policy initiatives at almost the exact same time. And it was eerie, really. So I would be in Tallahassee, Florida, and would hear about, the same quote unquote, innovative reforms that I had just seen the week before in Denver, Colorado, or Springfield, Illinois, or, some other place. Or I'd be working in school districts in Maryland, Arizona, and Mississippi, California, and they would somehow all implement virtually identical policies at the same time. And while these similarities, these commonalities, they cut across a variety of issue areas, the one thing they all had in common is that they would have a crushing effect on communities of color. So I got curious and I started digging into the people and the organizations that were driving these efforts. And I found that I kept running into the same small group of names. So I kept pulling at that thread and following the money. And what I learned was that billions of dollars were being pooled together and invested strategically around a particular agenda that was ravaging low-income communities of color in particular. In other words, while the communities that I was working with were fighting back against racial inequities, there was a small group of billionaires and multimillionaires who were actively opposing their efforts and, in effect, promoting the perpetuation of racial injustice. So to put that another way, what I discovered was that we have racism profiteers in this country, ultra wealthy people who put their resources to work in defending or expanding racial inequities in ways that result in greater economic or political power for themselves. People who profit from real harm that they cause in Black and brown communities. And I've been doing this long enough now that I've seen up close what that looks like. And it's truly devastating for millions of families. Yet because of how effectively these efforts have been hidden, or at least disguised, virtually no one seemed to know what they were up to. What I also learned was that this horrific form of modern day racism really wasn't adequately captured by the term systemic racism. Because, I think the problem is that it's a somewhat abstract and impersonal term. It makes it seem like these are natural or inevitable occurrences, like no one is responsible. In reality, behind all the billions of dollars in investments the ultra wealthy were making in opposition to communities of color, there was intentionality, there was strategy, which is why I refer to these dynamics as strategic racism, because I realized that the idea of systemic racism didn't adequately describe a system in which a small group of people were using their extraordinary wealth to uphold and expand systems of oppression, and were essentially deputizing so many other people in advancing the policies that I'd seen cause enormous suffering. But what this realization also did was it made me recognize that my initial strategy of attacking individual ignorance, by itself was doomed to fail. Because merely raising awareness of inequities would never be enough to dismantle the racism that was being defended so vigorously by these folks. In other words, the moral arc of our universe wouldn't naturally be bending toward anything resembling justice. On the contrary, it was being forcibly bent toward injustice and would continue to be unless the rest of us came together to stop it. So I'm going to share my screen now so I can hopefully give you some more details on what this looks like. Give me one moment, please. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. So really the reason why this is so important is because most people are like I was. They misdiagnose the problem, and thus we tend to misidentify potential solutions, and we don't ultimately change anything. So for many of us, when it comes to addressing systemic racism, we often act like there's nobody on the other side of that fight. Or in my case, what I thought was that we were fighting the vestiges of our racist history here in the US. And then there are some who think that, the opposition that we faced, what we often call the alt-right, or it's folks like, the QAnon shaman, or the Charlottesville white supremacists with tiki torches, or the folks terrorizing school boards over critical race theory all across the US. But that's not who creates all the laws and policies that are responsible for systemic racism. They're not the ones doing the heavy lifting and defending or even expanding these policies. So what people really need to understand, in my view, is that those folks are just foot soldiers in the strategic racism machine. And to really understand how systemic racism is perpetuated year after year, generation after generation, you have to understand how the rest of the machine operates and who it benefits. So let's start at the top, what I call the executive level. This is where we find the billionaire class, particularly corporate America and Wall Street executives. So some of these folks are pretty well known for their political activity, such as the Koch family, most notably Charles Koch, the chairman and CEO of Koch Industries and one of the richest men in the world, who's organized a network of dark money donors from the ultra wealthy class to support his agenda. But beyond these folks, there are a lot of folks who have received less public scrutiny, such as the hundreds of corporate members of ALEC. So for those of you who aren't familiar with ALEC, that stands for the American Legislative Exchange Council, which represents hundreds of the largest corporations in the US. And it's really the primary vehicle through which the ultra wealthy have organized themselves politically. It has a reported 300 plus corporate members and 2,000 legislative members who work together, usually secretively, on legislation that advances those corporations' common agenda. And ALEC is incredibly prolific. Over 1,000 of its model bills are introduced every year in state legislatures across the country, with 1 in 5 of them being passed into law. And while that legislation covers a broad range of issues, a large percentage of it has been directed at protecting, expanding, and benefiting from systemic racism. In other words, perhaps the most powerful force advancing systemic racism in the US is an organization whose current and recent members include many of the largest and most well-known corporations in the US, I'm talking about Walmart and Google, Home Depot, Coca-Cola, Ford, and the like. And the way that machine operates is that the ultra wealthy make huge investments in what I call the middle management level, the folks who implement their priorities, which includes a large network of think tanks, advocacy organizations, media outlets, and politicians. So they invest in the think tanks for research and for spokespeople to support their priorities. They invest in media outlets to shape the public narrative in ways that align with their agenda. And they invest in a network of advocacy organizations to push that agenda. And of course, they donate to politicians to get the votes that they need. And these organizations are the folks who really do the dirty work of upholding and expanding systemic racism on a daily basis. For example, they've been instrumental in dramatically expanding the role and size of police departments within communities of color and creating what is now the largest incarcerated population in the world. They're responsible for the targeting of undocumented immigrants with a barrage of cruel and discriminatory policies. And in education, they've been leading the dismantling of public school systems in favor of school vouchers and charter schools, which has inflicted massive harm within Black and brown communities. Meanwhile, the folks who get all the popular attention, the self-proclaimed patriots who are pushing back against racial justice, and the police officers and ICE officers who are enforcing the laws, are in reality little more than pawns and lackeys for the super rich. So before we dive any deeper, I think it's important to be clear about what I mean when I say that there's intent behind the strategic racism of the ultra wealthy. That doesn't mean that each of these folks is nefariously twisting his mustache as they come up with their next sinister plan to hurt folks of color. What I mean by intentionality is just that they know what they're doing. In most and maybe all cases, they knew beforehand what the impact would be from the policies they advocated for. And then after the fact, they know that the criminal legal policies that they've advocated for have resulted in more people in jail and prison, particularly people of color. They know that the immigration policies they've advocated for have led to the exploitation and dehumanization of immigrants. And they know that the education policies they've advocated for have led to major harm to students, families, and communities of color. They know this because the communities most affected by their actions have been saying so loud and clear for decades, and yet they keep going. They keep advocating for the same policies. That's what I mean by being intentional. They know that what they're doing will harm people, and especially people of color, and they do it anyway, which is, I imagine, why they usually try and hide it, or at least disguise it. So I'll be talking more about that, but first I'm going to break down the strategic racism machine and how it works, particularly within the criminal justice, education, and immigration systems. So I'll talk about what it looks like, the harm it causes, why it's a priority of the ultra wealthy, how they benefit from it, and some of the strategies they use to pull it off. So let's start with the criminal justice, or more accurately, the criminal legal system. And I think first it's useful to start by talking about what I found to be a gigantic disparity in people's experiences with this system. For example, I've lived much of my life in predominantly white communities. And in those communities, police are typically seen as, at worst, helpers, or often even heroes. And in most white people's eyes, the word police is synonymous with safety. But through my work, I've seen up close how the criminal legal system operates within predominantly Black and brown communities in Chicago and New York and Philadelphia and Los Angeles and Oakland and Miami and lots of other cities. And what I found is that most white people have absolutely no idea what that looks like. They don't know what it's like to have an overwhelming police presence around at all times, to have one's community treated as a occupied territory or a war zone, to have police and prosecutors opt for hostile and degrading treatment of the people they're supposed to be serving and protecting. And they don't know what it's like to have many of the members of your community yanked out of that community and put into a cage for doing the same things that happen within predominantly white communities with very different consequences. And unless you've seen that and how different it is from the average white experience, it can be hard to even believe that it exists. So with that as context, I think it's useful to ask this. How did the land of the free, as we like to call ourselves, wind up with the highest incarceration rate and the largest incarcerated population in the world? And how did we, with just 5% of the world's population, we being the US in this case, become home to over 20% of its prisoners? And the answer is through what I call the criminalization trap. So when you construct a criminal justice system or a criminal legal system, there are some basic choices that you have to make. One is, how are you going to define crime and determine where it's happening? Two is, who's going to respond to the crime that we find? And three, what is our response to that crime going to be? And we often don't talk about this, but each one of those questions actually presents us with a choice of numerous possibilities. And together, those possibilities carry a wide range of potential outcomes that can dramatically alter the direction a society takes. So how have we in the US answered them? With the following. And I'm going to share my screen again, hopefully. If I can find, where we go. One moment, sorry. Okay. All right, back on track. All right. So how have we in the US answered them? With the following. One, we have created policies that allow for the highly aggressive enforcement of extremely broad criminal laws, making it remarkably easy to identify so-called crimes and ensuring that virtually every person can be considered a criminal at some point. Two, we've prioritized the use of law enforcement responses to these crimes over many other possible responses, despite the fact that there's a fundamental mismatch between what law enforcement is trained to do and the skills needed to best address the vast majority of these behaviors. And three, we've emphasized profoundly harmful and punitive consequences for criminal offenses rather than those that would be more effective at holding offenders accountable in meaningful ways, repairing the damage caused by crime, meeting the needs of survivors, addressing the root causes of crime, and ultimately breaking the cycle of crime. So these decisions, you know, are what has created arguably the largest criminal legal system in the history of the world. And I refer to them as the criminalization trap because we didn't have to criminalize people this way. We chose to. In other words, our current system of mass criminalization and incarceration isn't an accidental consequence or an unfortunate side effect. The system is doing precisely what it was designed to do. The policies and practices that we have instituted over the past several decades could not have produced anything other than a vastly oversized, overbroad, and destructive criminal legal system, such as the one we have today. Of course, we also get to decide who is going to be ensnared by that criminalization trap. We could have placed it anywhere, but we weren't so indiscriminate. We could have placed it everywhere, but we weren't that inclusive. No, we were both precise and discerning in our approach. We set the criminalization trap where we knew, without a doubt, that it would catch people of color far more than others. How do we do that? Through the following. First, the highly aggressive enforcement of extremely broad criminal laws has been especially focused on Black and Brown communities. Two, we've invested particularly heavily in the criminal legal system within Black and Brown communities while underinvesting in systems that could otherwise address the causes of crime and respond to incidents of crime. And three, our desire to punish white criminals or so-called criminals often doesn't rise to the same level as our desire to punish people of color. So as a result of 40 plus years of this criminalization trap being the dominant public safety approach in the US, our criminal legal system has really become a mass criminalization and incarceration system, as you can see here, where we bring far more people into a far more expensive system that employs far more police officers, prosecutors, probation officers, and corrections officers. So that now, if we look back at the criminal legal system that existed in the 1970s, it seems almost incomprehensibly small in comparison. And to illustrate how much that changed, you know, we can look at how much we've spent over time. So for example, even after adjusting for inflation, we now spend almost 5 times as much as we did in the early 1970s. And cumulatively over that time, we have spent $5.3 trillion more than we would have if we had just kept our system at the same size. And I call this the $5.3 trillion mistake because I think it's useful to think about what we could have done with $5.3 trillion instead of what we actually did. Because we could have eliminated, in this country, we could have eliminated racial inequities in education and job opportunities and housing and healthcare. We could have eliminated intergenerational poverty. We could have ended our reliance on fossil fuels and addressed climate change before it ever reached crisis levels. We could have done all these things and more. Instead, what we did was create perhaps the largest criminal legal system in the history of the world. So now let's talk about the origins of this profoundly racist mass criminalization system. Because the typical story that's told about how this was created focuses on politicians, particularly Republican politicians and later Democratic ones, and how they've used tough on crime rhetoric and policy over the past several decades to drive this change. And most of the time, that story attributes these policy decisions to legitimate concerns over crime, and thus affirms that they were reasonable attempts to address a serious issue. What that story typically omits is how those policies got onto the desks of those politicians in the first place so that they could be voted on, and why they were put there. So for starters, if you've ever wondered how virtually every state adopted the same sort of harsh criminal sentencing laws, ALEC is your answer. ALEC is the common thread running through many of the laws that drove the growth of our criminal legal system. They created model 3 strikes laws, mandatory minimum sentencing laws, truth in sentencing laws, and many of the other really terrible policies that they were able to spread like wildfire all across the country. And just to give one example of how effective ALEC has been in getting its agenda implemented, in just 1 year, ALEC's Truth in Sentencing Act was signed into law in 25 states. Now, also beyond ALEC, very much worth mentioning, are private prison companies like the Geo Group and Core Civic, which have been hugely impactful in doing the legwork across the country and getting these ideas turned into law. And then there are the various so-called free market, pro-corporate think tanks like the Manhattan Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and the Reason Foundation, which have played and continue to play a critical role in pushing these tough on crime ideas. And while all these organizations have played a key role in creating and sustaining mass criminalization and incarceration, to truly understand the origins of the system, you have to understand who funds these organizations. And when you start to peel back the onion a little bit, you soon find that the true drivers of our current system all come from corporate America and Wall Street. Now, I break this down in detail in the book, including all the major corporations and corporate trade groups that pay dues and make financial contributions to organizations like ALEC, how the super wealthy use quote unquote philanthropic organizations to support the organizations that are driving mass criminalization, how a small number of investment firms and big banks own the vast majority of the private prison companies. And ultimately the conclusion you come to is that this collection of donors represents virtually every major industry and wealth center in the US. However, again, perhaps the individuals most responsible for supporting these organizations have been Charles Koch and the members of his network, which have donated tens of millions of dollars to the organizations I mentioned and continue to donate to them. So in other words, at the forefront of the effort to create the criminalization trap has been a large and diverse set of major US corporations, big banks, Wall Street firms, investment companies, and foundations created from amassing extreme wealth across numerous industries. These individuals and organizations are collectively responsible for funding and leading many of the organizations that have created and continue to advance our deeply racist criminal legal system. So from my perspective, while there are many concerning aspects of these dynamics, perhaps the most insidious is that the executives and shareholders of these organizations have become extravagantly wealthy off of the consumption and labor of the residents of the United States. And in return, they have used that wealth to then oppress the very people who made it possible. As for why they support this agenda, I break this down in great detail in the book. I'll summarize now. One, they profit directly from the privatization and expansion of the criminal legal system. This is big business. You're talking about housing, feeding, providing healthcare, and transporting over 2 million people who are incarcerated, which is more than the population of 15 entire US states. Plus, you're talking about supervision and services for nearly 5 million people on probation and parole. So these are there are multiple billion-dollar industries at play here. But also they generate profits from prison labor. Currently in this country, we have incarcerated people performing a huge variety of extremely low wage or even free labor for large corporations. But beyond that, the ultra wealthy use the police to limit democratic action and social movements. They use crime as a wedge issue to split people along racial and socioeconomic lines. The criminal legal system is very effective at preserving white supremacy and the current racial hierarchy in the US. And it also helps their preferred political candidates, the folks who support their other political priorities, to win elections. So there are many reasons why this is very effective. But let me go to another issue. I'll go to immigration, because the same types of dynamics are replicated in other issue areas, including this one. So I won't go into great detail here, but once again, corporate America and Wall Street have been instrumental in creating the severe hostility and degradation faced by immigrant communities. In fact, what we did was to take the same criminalization trap approach I described earlier, and they expanded it to include immigrants alongside US citizens. So as an example, if you look at the key drivers of that process, you'll find many of the same actors. So I'll give a couple examples. ALEC, once again, representing hundreds of the largest US corporations, they've adopted a number of really horrible immigration-related model bills, such as their so-called resolution against amnesty and their resolution to enforce our immigration law and secure our border, which requires states to eliminate so-called sanctuary policies in order to combat the quote-unquote illegal alien invasion, which has, according to their bill, produced an increase in violent crime, gangs, threat to public health, billions in cost to the taxpayer, and jobs taken from Americans. Again, this is coming from, the corporate America. And then in the book, I also tell the story of a state senator from Arizona named Russell Pierce. Russell Pierce was, I guess you could say, a guy with a dream. It was a racist and xenophobic dream, but a dream nonetheless, I suppose, to pass legislation that would dramatically escalate the criminalization of immigrants in Arizona. And for 5 years, he tried to pass the bill, and for 5 years, he failed to get the votes he needed. But then he took his bill to ALEC, and with their help and with their money, in 2010, he was able to pass SB 1070, one of the most aggressively racist laws in modern US history. And not only that, ALEC adopted his bill as one of their model bills that led to 24 copycat bills being introduced in states across the country, with 5 of them passing, along with hundreds of other anti-immigrant state laws and local ordinances being passed, causing almost unimaginable harm in immigrant communities across the US. And as for why organizations like ALEC support this agenda, the rationale is almost identical to what I described with regard to the criminal legal system. They profit from it directly. They use the police and ICE to keep people afraid and submissive. They use immigration as a wedge issue to divide people along racial and socioeconomic lines. The immigration system as constructed is very effective at preserving white supremacy and the racial hierarchy in the US, and it's a political winner for them. So let me just go briefly to my third issue that I wanted to introduce, and that's education. In the book, I talk a lot about this issue, and specifically school privatization, how public schools are being systematically replaced with voucher programs and charter schools. Now, however one might feel about this issue or about charter schools or about vouchers, it's important to understand that it is unmistakably a hostile takeover of public schools that is being led by a small group of billionaires. In other words, if not for this staggering financial investment of this small group of individuals, there is simply no way that charter schools and school vouchers would have spread so rapidly and caused such extensive harm to Black and Brown communities across the country. So, for example, in the book, I looked at just 10 billionaires or families who've prioritized school privatization. So I looked at the Koch family, the Walton family, as in the Walmart Waltons, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and a handful of others. And I tracked how much they spent on 50 organizations that have been active in promoting charter schools and school vouchers. Now, there are many more billionaires who fall in the same camp and many more organizations that have been created to advance this agenda. But looking just at these 10 sources, to these 50 organizations, advocacy groups, think tanks, charter school investment funds, and so on, what I found was that just these 50 organizations and just these 10 individuals had accounted for $3.2 billion in investments. And again, this is just a small piece of the overall effort, but I think it can provide a sense of how these individuals use their wealth in ways that create an exponentially greater role for themselves in shaping education policies than the parents, students, and community members who are most affected by these policies. As for why they do it and how they profit off of it, the book goes into a lot of detail about that. And I don't want to suggest that this sector is monolithic, because they're not. But the shorthand is that many of these folks fight for school privatization for the same reasons that they fight to privatize Social Security and the post office, why they despise Medicare, Medicaid, and single-payer healthcare, why they love private prisons and immigration detention centers. Number one, because they can make money off of it. 2, because they can reduce costs and thus their own tax liability, and 3, because it gives them greater control to shape policy around their interests. So I think it's very important to understand that these efforts to promote charter schools and school vouchers, which are often portrayed as acts of benevolent philanthropy or as racial justice efforts, are firmly aligned with the economic interests of the ultra wealthy. And these individuals have given every indication that their sights are set on all public schools, not just those within communities of color. So that is a summary of what strategic racism looks like in these 3 issue areas, though we could certainly talk about many others. But beyond that, what the book is really intended to do is give people a roadmap for what it will take to truly address these problems. Because while it's very doable, there's still not enough people supporting racial justice efforts and far too many people opposing them. The good news, though, is that the solutions to these problems are actually pretty straightforward. You know, in the book, I go into great detail, and they've all been identified by grassroots leaders from the communities most directly impacted by these issues, and they're all eminently attainable. So they include, 1, right-sizing all aspects of the criminal legal system and reinvesting the extra resources into multidisciplinary prevention, intervention, and systems of care. 2, eliminating the so-called, Juan Crow discrimination against undocumented immigrants and enabling all 11 million to become citizens. And 3, ending school privatization and addressing the education debt owed to communities of color across the country by truly designing schools around the developmental needs of students. But beyond that, though, what I hope people will do is really join this effort of reimagining what we could be as a country. Because in the book, I talk about creating what I call liberatory communities, which are communities designed around the needs of the people who live there, by the people who live there. Because, just putting it in fiscal terms, like if you were to eliminate these 3 examples of systemic racism that I talked about and implement some pretty modest wealth taxes and taxes on Wall Street and corporate America, you can quickly free up $1 trillion a year. And there's a whole lot you can do with $1 trillion a year. I give some examples in the book of how you can increase education spending by 50%. You can put the US on the path to environmental sustainability. You can make public colleges and universities tuition free. You can hire 1 million new community health and safety workers, like mental and behavioral health experts and social workers, to create a humane alternative to the current mass criminalization system. You can create a universal pre-K program. You can do all of those things with $1 trillion. Now, there are a lot of different options for what we could be doing, but the key point is that we need to ensure that public investments match our values and our needs, because right now, I would suggest that they clearly are not. And the reality is, though, that there's really only one effective counterweight to the power of the organized wealth that stands in opposition to such an agenda, and that's the power of organized people. So to resist the corporate American Wall Street agenda and ultimately advance one that's more favorable to low-income, working class, and middle-class families, we need to build people-powered organizations that can advance multiracial mass movements. And I talk in the book about some strategies for doing that, but what I would love to do now is stop talking. And in addition to taking any questions that anyone has and getting people's reflections on these issues, I would love to have a group conversation about what we can do collectively to address what I call strategic racism. So thank you so much for your time and your attention, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Jim. That's it's so much information right there, and you have distilled it in a way that's really understandable, and we can relate to that in our struggles through Latin America as well, with the militarization and the root causes of migration. So we can see that it's all interconnected. So I wanna allow folks to open your mics and your cameras if you want to participate. I do have a question here that Aaron Schneider sent to us. And I'll start with that and then allow folks if you want to put your questions in the chat, that will be helpful as well. I see a question here in the chat where we can buy the book that we have been listening about. It is very interesting, and I would like to share it with my family members. Is a question from I think a member of Not One More Table that's participating tonight with us. Aaron,
yeah, thank you. The book is available at all the major book sellers. You can get it directly from Cornell Press. You can get it from local bookstores. I like to refer people to, and of course I'm going to forget the website, as an alternative to, say, the Amazons of the world. Maybe somebody can remember, if you do, or somebody knows, if you can put it in the chat, the online bookseller that gets books from local bookstores. I'm blanking on the name of it, but I will find it.
We will do a little bit of research on that, and we'll share it on the chat in a second. In the meantime, I'm gonna read this question. Can capitalism exist without strategic racist tools to increase rates of exploitation of marginalized groups?
Oh, sorry, I just found it. It's called bookshop.org.
Okay.
Great question. As a number of really excellent scholars have pointed out, folks who have been doing a lot of writing and talking about racial capitalism, it certainly never has. It has never existed without that. As for whether it could, I leave that to the theorists. What I would say is, I don't know that it's ever been true that we have had a strictly or purely capitalist system. As folks like Noam Chomsky say, in this country, we usually have capitalism for poor and working class folks and socialism for the rich. And I think that's largely been true, but it has been a mixed model, just a profoundly unjust mixed model. So what I prefer to think about is, I always start with the end in mind. Like, what would it actually look like to have an healthy, equitable, society that actually is structured around people's human needs and caring for those needs, and work backwards from that. And is it conceivable that there would be some elements of what we consider to be capitalism in there? I suppose. But that's, that's not where I like to start my thinking personally. I'm sorry, was there another question, Rebecca?
Yeah, great answer. Thank you so much. Yeah, we have another question in the chat from Hannah Smith, our intern. Hi, Hannah. Thank you for being here. As you mentioned, legislator plays a role in facilitating strategic racism. I think it would be beneficial for to form organizations with lawyers to actively reverse the legislator being passed by corrupt businesses leaders like at ALEC. So she's a student from Regis.
Wonderful. Thanks for the question or the comment. The combination. Hannah. So I think, so as someone who spent, the better part of the last 2 decades trying to dismantle some of these systems and the policies and legislation that upholds and expands these systems, what I would suggest is that when you go into those fights, whether you're a lawyer or not, or a team of lawyers or not, I've worked in large teams and medium-sized teams and small teams and by myself. In whatever capacity you go in, you are always at a huge disadvantage because the folks on the other side have sort of gigantic head starts in terms of their ability to influence policymakers, their ability to get their messages and perspective out into the media and public narrative, and a variety of other ways. And that there really is, the only way to counteract that is if you have masses of people who essentially give policymakers no other choice but to go along with, the more just alternative. That's been, the only strategy that worked, which is not to say, that other strategies haven't achieved some gains. There are lots of lawyers out there who can tell stories about, policies they've written or lawsuits they've filed that maybe chipped away at some of this structure. But what those lawyers will often also tell you is, if there was nobody invested in preserving that victory afterwards, it's not like the opposition goes away. And so those gains will be rolled back very, very quickly because you're outgunned almost all the time. So that's why so many of us talk about, even in the lawyering field, we talk about the need for what we call movement lawyering, which is thinking about how to use your training and your skills as a lawyer in service of mass movements of people.
Yeah, thank you for that. I guess that goes in line with something that you were proposing or have proposed in the book about liberatory communities, so how do we work together? And I find it interesting that you point out that like smaller groups are going to make more transformative efforts. But how do we dismantle all these systems of repression that have been institutionalized for so long? So I know that's a big question, but
yeah. I actually did try to break that down piece by piece for each of the 3 systems in the book, not here because we don't have time for that, I don't think, here. But unfortunately, like we don't have to recreate the wheel. It's not like I thought of all this stuff myself. That because there are some amazing grassroots leaders who know these systems inside and out, who know how their communities have been affected by it and all the different permutations of these systems. And they've documented what it takes to do it. And so what I tried to do is sort of pass that along. That's the sort of logistical question. The broader strategic question is, how do you actually win all that stuff that people have identified? And that's in some ways it's an easier answer. It's just much harder to implement, which is we have to get large communities of people invested in doing what it takes to dismantle these things. Right, because even an example like 2 years ago, when George Floyd was murdered, we heard over and over that this was a wake-up call for the country, and that we were finally going to do something about these issues. But we haven't, and it's not because we don't know how to address these systems. It's because the other side that's invested in these systems, they went to work, right? Where they started organizing their own folks, where they started putting out, I can share on one of my slides, didn't have time for it today, but the Heritage Foundation, one of the think tanks that I mentioned, which gets millions of dollars from the Koch brothers and the Koch network and others, they put out a pledge, a police pledge, vowing never to defund the police, where they got US senators, members of Congress, hundreds of state legislators, and 200,000 plus citizens to sign on to that pledge, where you have, the politicians who are heavily supported by corporate interests, like Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, who's one of the leading candidates to be the next Republican candidate for president. He tweets out and continually says in public that in the US, we have a major under incarceration problem. So there are, and then on the flip side, all the energy that surfaced that summer in opposition to racial inequities, racial injustice in the criminal legal system, we weren't able to sustain it, right? So what I think is important is we think about, okay, rather than waiting for the next tragedy to happen, how can we build systems, ecosystems of community power that can sustain that kind of energy and actually have it translate into real change? Because, for me, the way I think about it, it's a math problem. Like when our power is greater than theirs, we win. When it's not, we lose. So we just have to figure out what are the ingredients for I'm mixing metaphors, but what are the ingredients for building that level of power?
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. The interpreter is doing an awesome job. Thank you, Olga, for keeping up with us. We're trying to keep the speed slower, but
I have to apologize to Olga. I know she was sending me messages telling me to slow down. I'm very sorry. I hope it didn't make your job harder than it already is. I couldn't see the messages, and sometimes I do get carried away, so I apologize.
It's been just like it's obvious that you're passionate about this, and it's such an important conversation to have, not only in the current context of what you were just explaining, but like something that has, been so embedded in our culture and our systems, and that we are taking more time to dismantle it, right? So, and this is the moment. So that's great. I have a question and comment here from Maria Hamlin Zuniga, who's joining us from far away in Central America. And I see also Pablo from Chile has joined us. Does your book give examples of different alternative approaches in order to examine them? And then she is part of this People's Health movement, so she wants to share this information with them. I also think it would be, we need to share the presentation with the movement people. Yes, of course, one of the reasons we wanted to record this is to make it available to folks. DJPC is also part of different solidarity movements. So that's, a way that we can share this, because as we were saying before, even though you focus on US criminalization and the legal system here, you look at the immigration issues and you look at the education, and how all of them are connected. But also us that work more in terms of transnational solidarity, we are also looking at, how the systems here affect us. Policies made here definitely affect our communities. in different countries of Latin America and the world as well. We're seeing that. So yes, for sure, we're going to share this, and please, everyone that's part of here should feel free to share the information. Is there any other questions that some folks might have? As I said, I invite you to open your mic or your camera if you want to share your question, or use the chat. And in the meantime, talking about the, how do we resist, how we transform. As you all know, here in Colorado and Denver, and well, not outside of Denver and Aurora, we have one of these immigration detention centers managed by a for-profit corporation, GEO, which you also presented in your slides. So we are involved in trying to close down that facility, right? So on every other month, there's a vigil that the American Friends Service Committee folks organize, and students and community members come. The next vigil is on May 2nd. So if you all have the opportunity to go there, it's at 6 p.m. in front of the Aurora Geo Detention Center. And that's another way of keeping our voices out there, saying enough is enough. Our communities need to be together. We all know that incarceration, detention centers are really incarceration centers. So it's like, we need to continue doing those efforts of organizing against them. So any other questions, folks?
Hi, Rebecca, this is Anna speaking. I just wanted to mention, it's kind of scary to hear senators say that we're under incarcerated, when we've seen in this presentation and throughout education, that we have our majority of our young people incarcerated. And so for me, it's more of like, how can we bring that to educating them rather than putting them in prison? That's a comment and maybe a suggestion of how can we educate rather than incarcerate.
Sure, thank you, Anna, for your comment and suggestion. I mean, I think we're all trying to educate ourselves, and it's like, how do we also educate some, I'm not gonna say like some, maybe how can we influence our policymakers to change and not to sell themselves to the corporations, right? So that would be something else. Okay, so we have another comment here from Joe Butler. Thank you, Jim, for great presentations. Thank you for the team of organized this meeting. Special thanks to Olga for the interpretation, and he has to leave us tonight, but yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we are getting to the end of our time allotted for this conversation. I know that we didn't cover everything. As Jim was saying, that we could have a whole day conversation on this, but we might want to do another of these forums and focus maybe on one of the subjects and go more in depth in one of them. If that's something that people would like to hear, let me know, and we will organize it. Catherine Rodriguez, what is the name of the book? So the book, you want to answer that question?
Sure. It's called Rich Thanks to Racism: How the Ultra Wealthy Profit from Racial Injustice.
Yes. And if you don't mind typing the website where we can, that's more author friendly.
Sure.
So folks can click on that and maybe order the book if you're interested in it. I'm sure we can also ask our local libraries if they don't have it to purchase it, so more people can benefit from reading it, and maybe we can do a book club on this. That's another idea that we can explore. Any other questions, folks? Don't be shy. I know it's the end of the day, almost the end of the week. Well, any final comments, Jim, that you would like to make?
No, just thanks to you, Rebecca, for organizing, and for everyone for attending. It's been really fun and a pleasure to be with you all, and I look forward to hopefully continuing the conversation and hopefully action in some form or fashion. So it was great to meet you all.
Great, thank you. So everyone, as we said before, this will be available, is actually being live streamed. It's available on our Facebook page, and we will be sharing it. We will be sharing the recordings, and hopefully we'll have another of these conversations soon. I want to thank everyone that came from different parts of the world and different parts of the US and different parts of the Colorado community to listen to this, and feel free to send us a message. I know that some of the folks are connected to the Not One More table. So if you want to have like a specific conversation on the immigration issue, we can do that. I mean, as you can see, it's all interconnected. Our role is the Denver Justice and Peace Committee is to provide a space for meaningful conversation, and hopefully sometime soon we can do these conversations in person. Right now, we're trying to keep our communities safe, and we'll continue doing the meetings in this format, but we will also find ways of getting together. Jim, thank you so much for being here. Olga Sosa from the Community Language Co-op, thank you for interpreting for us. Thank you everyone that came today to listen to this conversation, and we hope to see you soon, and everyone stay safe. Hasta pronto, la lucha continúa.